I'm joined by Susanna Molins Literas. She's a PhD student at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, where she's writing a dissertation on the history of the book in Timbuktu, particularly in relationship to the cultural history of Al-Andalus. She's also been at the core of the group spearheading the Tombouktou Manuscripts Project, so she's really an ideal person to talk to about what's been going on over the last few days in the city. Susanna, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Bruce.
Speaking really broadly, I wonder if we could begin for people unfamiliar with the history of books in West Africa. Can you characterize the corpus of early Timbuktu manuscripts that you study, and more generally, the nature of the extant manuscripts from the medieval and early modern periods from this part of the world? Like, what are we talking about here?
We're basically talking about manuscripts that the earliest records that we have are from late 13th, early 14th century, but the majority of manuscripts date from the 16th, 17th, and 18th century up to the colonial period. Those are the majority of the manuscripts. We have some old examples of Qurans from earlier periods, but the bulk of the manuscripts come from a bit later. These manuscripts are written in Arabic, of course, in the language of scholarship of West Africa during this period. These are mainly manuscripts that cover the range of Islamic sciences, basically Quranic commentaries, Quranic Tawheed, theological texts. At the same time, we get lots of juridical texts based on the Maliki tradition, which is the tradition of jurisprudence in this region of the Islamic world. And then, of course, we have treatises on mathematics, medicine, astrology, and, of course, the mysticism, a lot of texts on mystic Sufism, and of course the esoteric sciences are also represented, for example, astrology and numerology and amulet making and so on. So this is broadly the themes that are covered in these manuscripts. Of course, that is the corpus, the text, but at the same time we have a lot of manuscripts of local content, for example, correspondence, many letters, private letters, but at the same time you have letters between rulers and different states, correspondence, and of course legal documentation relating to inheritance, to juridical rulings, and of course these are very valuable for historical purposes, as we know.
And are these primarily on paper? Are they some paper, some parchment?
The majority are paper. There are very few in parchment. So we're talking basically about paper here, and the majority of the paper is in fact European paper. European paper brought from Venice, Genoa, and other areas and imported into this region. So in fact, the paper trade was very important and very expensive. So paper was a very expensive commodity. So these manuscripts, even at the time that they were written, were very highly priced and very expensive.
So some of what you're studying then is the influence of the infusion of European paper to West Africa, and then the transmission of these books back into Europe. Is that part of the context here?
That's part of the context. I mean, really, the trade went both ways. So, as we know, the trans-Saharan caravans imported. Timbuktu. One of the reasons Timbuktu became such an important center of learning was precisely because of this trade caravans, and it became such an important city of trade, and it had surplus of capital, and therefore the rulers of Timbuktu were able to give their scholars a lot of money to work on the scholarship. So there was surplus of capital to invest in scholarship.
Right.
And so we're looking at the history of, very little work really has been done on this region. So there's much still to be studied. And we're studying all aspects, material aspects of the book, from script to the materials that were used, the inks, the pens, how the books traveled from one area to another, from where the paper came, were books that were copied from other areas of the Islamic world and sent here, or books produced locally and sent to other areas of the Islamic world, and all these processes and movements.
Wow. So the archive then of books in Timbuktu isn't just the individual books, it's a record of trade in the Mediterranean, North African worlds in this period.
Trade, and of course many other, as we know, sources can tell us so much. It's just not just what is contained in the content of the manuscripts themselves, but we're looking at broader areas. I mean, one of my colleagues is looking specifically at scripts, and he's doing a fascinating research on the scripts themselves and what they say about how, for example, Islam spread in this area of West Africa just by the different types of scripts, different type of writing. There's many theories, but it's not very clear yet where this different type of writing, because the writing in this area of our manuscripts is very different than the writing that you might encounter, say, in Baghdad or in Saudi Arabia. If you get somebody, an expert from Arabia, they might not be able to read the manuscripts here. You have to be trained in the local Western scripts, Western in the Islamic world, to understand these manuscripts. So all of these factors come into play when you have to study these manuscripts.
Now, can you talk, if that's the general context of what these manuscripts are, can you talk a little bit about your understanding of what has happened in the last few days? I know the initial reports were that 30,000 manuscripts or so in the Ahmad Baba Institute were burned. And I know that just in the last 24 hours, and you've posted this on the Timbuktu Manuscripts Project website, that it may be a little less dire or a lot less dire than we had initially heard. So what are you hearing from people that you know in the city on the ground?
What we're hearing, the reports, well, the first thing we have to say is that Timbuktu has been cut off of any communication for the last 10 days. So in fact, we do not have any direct communication with people in Timbuktu because there is no network, cell phone network, and no electricity, no email, of course. So communication with people in Timbuktu directly has not been possible for the last 10 days. Now, the reports that came out on Monday morning were from the mayor of Timbuktu, and he spoke from Bamako. He's not in Timbuktu at the moment, he's in Bamako. And the reports stated that the library had been burnt, the Ahmad Baba Institute. Now, this created a bit of confusion because, in fact, there's not only one library. The Ahmad Baba Institute has the older building of the institute that was founded by UNESCO in 1974, and this was the original building where this institute started and that housed the majority of the manuscripts. Then, in 2009, a new building that was funded by the South African government in cooperation with the Malian government was built in the center of town, close to the Sankore Mosque. And this new state-of-the-art archive with archiving facilities, restoration facilities, digitization facilities, this is the new building that was in the reports. However, what people didn't know is that, in fact, the majority of the manuscripts had not moved from the old building to storage in the new building for a number of reasons. So although the building was partially functioning, the new building that is, the manuscripts were not stored there. There were only a limited number of manuscripts in the new building because one of the departments that had moved was the restoration department, the department in charge of cleaning the manuscripts, of making boxes for the manuscripts. So they had moved a certain amount of manuscripts, limited, we don't know exactly how many, perhaps a few hundred, into that building to clean them, to restore them, and to make boxes for them. So initially, when we heard the reports of the burning of the building, first of all, what we asked was, which building? And then the reports started coming, this is the new building, and then we thought, all right. And then by Monday evening, when the French and Malian troops entered the city, there was footage from Sky News, and one of the reporters that was embedded in the French forces actually reported from the new Ahmad Baba building. We know the building very well. We have been there many times. The last time I was there personally was in December of 2011, just a few months before the rebel takeover. So I know the condition of the building quite well. So when I looked at the images of the journalist of Sky News on Monday evening, I could see clearly that the building had not been burnt. The building looked more or less in the same condition as what I can recall. I mean, the structure of the building. Of course, what you could see that was quite spectacular were piles of boxes, of empty boxes, of these boxes that are used to store the manuscripts, lying all over the floor. The journalist assumed that these piles represented manuscripts that had been destroyed or stolen, but these could also have been boxes that are already empty. So we don't know We can't
Right.
say with any certainty whether these boxes contain manuscripts or not, or they were just boxes that were being made. In the images, you could also see some piles of ashes, but a small amount, not anything like the burning of thousands and thousands of manuscripts would have produced.
So are
And also,
you?
yeah.
So are you? As someone who studies medieval European books, the idea of even a few dozen being destroyed is just, kind of horrific. And I wonder, are you worried about what you and your colleagues are going to find, or do you feel more confident?
Very worried, but it was just the initial shock on Monday of hearing that the whole library had been burned.
Yeah.
That was tempered when we saw the images. But
Right.
of course, any loss is a huge loss, as you say, especially because the majority of the manuscripts have not been studied, they have not been digitized, and they have not been cataloged. So, in fact, we have very little information on the manuscripts themselves. There's a very small percentage of manuscripts that, in fact, have been cataloged. So there could be many that have been lost that we don't even know what they are
Right.
or any information about them. So, of course, a loss like that is a huge loss because it's almost worse when you lose something that you don't even know what it is, what existed. So, of course, that would be a huge loss. But it's just the journalistic reports that were quite extreme when they first came out on Monday, from what we have been able to gather, at least from the information we have at the moment, which, as I say, we still don't have direct contact with people in Timbuktu. As of today, still no direct communication. So we still yet to find out what has happened to the old building housing the majority of the manuscripts. As of 10 days ago, more or less, before the communications blackout, we know that that building was still in okay condition. When first the rebels took over, they had ransacked the offices, and they had taken some of the computers and so on, but they had not touched the manuscript. So this is as of 10 days ago. What is the situation now? We can't say with any certainty.
Right. I wonder if you've thought at all in this context about, the digitization projects in European archives that I know of are all about preserving manuscripts against, the ravages of time and maybe a flood or a natural disaster. To think of a digitization project that's so relevant to a really violent history on the ground, it casts it in a whole different light. And I wonder if you and your colleagues have been talking about that, about the aims of the Timbuktu Manuscripts Project in that kind of political regard.
Absolutely. We, in fact, discuss this quite often. I mean, this is one of the issues, digitization is one of the very burning issues in this region. But at the same time, there have been many obstacles to digitizing the collections. Not only, I mean, money-wise, these are thousands and thousands of manuscripts, some of them very, very long. Digitization requires very expensive equipment to be done properly, proper training. The conditions in Timbuktu themselves are extremely harsh. So very often computers, equipment breaks because the dust goes everywhere. So, I mean, much money has been given by all sorts of donors for digitalization, but the process is quite slow. And even our colleagues in the Ahmed Baba Institute themselves can't give us an exact number of manuscripts that have been digitized. But we, for example, our policy had always been the material that each of us works in. We get permission from the people that we work with to digitize our own material. And we always have copies, we make extra copies, we make the copies available to the libraries themselves, of course, because this is another of the issues. Very often we find that researchers come to a place such as Timbuktu, take digital copies, go away, and then the local people never benefit from anything. Right. So this is another of those ethical dilemmas that we, for example, in our website, we don't like to put full manuscripts available to everyone, because what will be the motivation of a researcher who in his very cozy home in North America can download a full manuscript, work, publish it, and never having set foot in Timbuktu? Wow. For us, it's a real ethical dilemma, because the people of Timbuktu really survive because of this. They survive through to visits. There's very little, before, of course, this whole rebel, but the few visitors that they received was a huge source of income for the town. The researchers that come and periodically visit the city, another of the huge sources of income for thousands of families in Timbuktu. So this is really also an ethical dilemma in terms of that the local people that have been safeguarding these manuscripts for hundreds of years should also benefit from the digitalization processes that are put in place, and how to do that best serves both the needs of the wider intellectual needs, and at the same time the needs of the local population is also very important.
Great. Well, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I wish you and your colleagues the best of luck, and thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, and thank you for paying attention to this issue. And we hope that it will still be something that people will take interest in, because it's really a great treasure. And the more people are interested and ask about Timbuktu, and it's not forgotten and regarded as a place almost that didn't exist, the better it will be for Timbuktu and the manuscripts and the heritage.
Well,
Thank
thank you
you.
so much for being such a great spokesperson for it. Thanks so much.
Thank you.